On a wet and stormy morning on the 10th of August 1893, three men, a boating engineer called Edward Scott, a young highborn lieutenant called Cecil Hambrough, and his guardian, Alfred John Monson, were out hunting rabbits on the Ardlamont estate near Tynebrugh in the west of Scotland. James Dunn, a watchmaker from Newcastle, on holiday in part of the schoolhouse, watches them through the pantry window.
The three walked a short way together, then Hambrough struck off by himself to the right, Monson and the other man keeping to the left. It was about 3 minutes after I lost sight of them that I heard the shot.
20-year-old Cecil Hambrough had been shot dead. According to Monson and Scott, who reappeared shortly after carrying Hambrough's shotgun, he must have slipped or tripped while walking on the top of a sunk fence. His gun went off and he suffered a fatal wound to the back of the head in the area behind his right ear. They said when they found him, he was already dead and lying in a ditch. Some of the estate staff helped to carry Hambrough's body back to Ardlamont House, wrapped in a rug. Then his wounds were washed and his body was dressed. The local GP, Dr. Macmillan, was called for.
The body was still warm, but rigor mortis was commencing in the limbs, showing that the death must have taken place about 3 hours previously. The wound was exactly what I would expect to find from a charge of small shot fired from a distance of perhaps 12 inches.
Initially, Dr. Macmillan wrote a report to the Procurator Fiscal saying he believed it was indeed an accident. The Procurator Fiscal is the public prosecutor in Scotland. As part of their role, they investigate all sudden and suspicious deaths and conduct fatal accident inquiries. Scott took a boat back to Glasgow and disappeared. Hambrough's body was buried at the family plot at Ventnor on the Isle of Wight, and Monson stayed on at Ardlamont with his wife and 3 kids. Then, 9 days after he first reported to the Fiscal, Dr. Macmillan wrote again, saying he'd changed his mind and didn't believe Hambrough could have shot himself after all.
Having handled and tried the gun, now in the possession of the Procurator Fiscal, I am convinced the injuries were not caused in the way I thought possible.
If you haven't heard the first episode, I suggest you go back and start there. Not that I want to lose you, but you might get more from this episode if you start from the very beginning, because there is a lot of detail involved. It's also worth heading for the links in the show notes so you can follow the trial papers and diagrams as you listen. I'm Pennie Stuart, and this is Inside Forensic Science, the Ardlamont Mystery, Episode 2, The Scene.
Glasgow Herald, Wednesday, August 30th, 1893. The unfortunate shooting fatality which occurred at Ardlamont, Kyles of Bute, is still involved in a good deal of uncertainty. No new facts have been ascertained.
Westminster Gazette, August 31st. Sensational mystery in Scotland. Suspicious death of an English lieutenant. A landed proprietor arrested. Remarkable circumstance. A great sensation has been created in the west of Scotland by the arrest of Mr. A.J. Monson, a landed proprietor there, as the result of police inquiries into the death of Mr. W.C.D. Hambrough.
The excitement regarding the case reached a climax on Wednesday afternoon when Mr. Monson, the tenant of Ardlamont, was arrested. Sheriff Shape and the representatives of the criminal authorities for the county took an extraordinary number of precognitions on Tuesday, and the substance of these was, it was alleged, sufficient to justify them in taking this important step.
With Monson arrested and charged with Hambrough's murder, the police start to search for the mysterious Scott, and the press go into a feeding frenzy.
A man and woman are reported to have arrived at the Central Hotel, Glasgow, on the evening of Friday, 11th of August. They signed their names as E. Scott and Miss Scott on separate lines and left no address. The couple then left the next morning with their destination unknown.
The police say they are confident that they will successfully find Scott. There were apparently rumours that Scott was actually a woman in disguise. This is now known to be false. Description of Scott circulated by the police on the 1st of September. Wanted, a man about 35 years of age, looks younger.
About 5'10" in height, of sallow complexion, with small dark moustache and steel grey eyes. Mr. Scott is believed to have been present at the funeral in the Isle of Wight.
For some considerable time it's been known in London who the wanted man Scott is and who his associates are. Yet, incredible to relate, the Procurator Fiscal, it would seem, hesitates to act.
Police at Cork think a man arrested for robbing a constable might be Scott. The prisoner gave his name as Scott and he is thought closely to resemble the missing Scott in appearance.
And so it goes on. Hambrough is dead and buried. Scott's on the run. Monson is in Inverary jail, where, and I love this particular detail from the newspapers, he has applied to have the rules relaxed in his favour so he can be granted a better class of food. Consequently, according to Lloyd's Weekly on the 3rd of September, Monson's meals are now being sent from the George Hotel. Let's park the newspapers for the moment because, to be honest, there is so much information and misinformation flying around that you end up down multiple rabbit holes and it really isn't terribly helpful. Back to the Ardlamont estate. Hambrough died on the 10th of August, but Monson wasn't arrested until the 30th of August, so there was a considerable delay before the scene of the accident was treated as a scene of a crime. And that has significant implications for the investigation. If this had all happened now, things would have been treated very differently, right from the get-go.
My name is Rachel Aiken. I'm a senior forensic scene examiner for the Scottish Police Authority. So that's the Scottish equivalent of a CSI. I have been involved with firearms incidents, suicide, accidental discharge and murder. But in essence, all the scenes would be approached the same way. So every incident in which a firearm's discharged, they always have a crime scene manager. So as soon as the crime scene manager gets there, generally this will be after they've established that the deceased is indeed deceased, because the number one priority for the police is the preservation of life. So once they've confirmed that life is not compatible, then that's when we lock everything down, a cordon gets put in place, a scene log started. The scene log's basically got who's coming in to the scene, why are they coming into the scene, what time, what protective equipment they're wearing, if they've been involved in any other scenes relating to this investigation, or in terms of firearms, have they been near anything that could possibly have firearms residue. And then at the end, when we sign out, that's also on the log as well. So in general, the crime scene manager and the scene examiner would discuss the parameters of the investigation. We would both go through and check that the cordon is sufficient to cover the area that we want to investigate. We would establish a common approach path, ideally one that hasn't been used by either the deceased or suspects. It would always be good, if you can, to identify the path taken by, say, paramedics or the first person to discover the scene. But generally, all of that is done by the first police officer that attends. They gather that information, pass it on to the CSM, and then we establish a common approach path to the deceased.
And that's even if there wasn't any evidence of a suspicious death at the start. There's been a death by firearm, lock it down.
Yeah, because you can never be too careful. So once that's been established, basically go in full PPE. So you're talking, like you see on the TV, you've got your white suit, hairnet, gloves, shoe coverings and face mask. The first thing we always do is record the scene. Record everything as it is as soon as you get there and see it. In Police Scotland, we're quite fortunate at the minute that we all have Pronto devices, which are basically a mobile phone that has all our police systems on it. And within that, there is a camera functionality that means that the first officer on any scene, if there's a risk that any evidence could be lost, misplaced, destroyed, they can snap a quick picture on that secure device. But on top of that, obviously we're there to record absolutely everything. So we have our 360 pano photography that gets stitched together by our forensic imaging department and can be shown in court, and you can sort of move through those images to give the jury a better idea. Sometimes we will also be asked to video the scene as well, and then we go for the good old standard DSLR camera and record absolutely everything, because we don't know at that stage what will be relevant later on down the line. So you could say that us scene examiners are definitely, control freaks. We like to record everything just in case. I would have expected the local constable to have been there, but obviously that didn't happen. They did get the doctor to the scene, to the house after the deceased had been removed, who was quite happy with the circumstances that were provided at that time. But again, there's so much loss of evidence there. We've got one witness who's actually washed the blood from the deceased. They could have picked up anything from the rug that he was wrapped in or the cart, which they used to convey him back to the house. So even though the doctor had a look at the deceased at the house, there's no accounting for what might have happened between leaving the scene and arriving there. You've got all the interactions with all those people. You've got the interactions with the rug. You've got the interactions with the sponge. Was it clean water? Had that sponge or cloth been used before? So, it's probably a good thing that they weren't looking for trace forensic evidence at that time.
Rachel's right. They weren't looking for trace forensic evidence because many of the tools and techniques available to today's investigators simply didn't exist back in 1893.
So much of this entire case was just based upon witness testimony. I really don't envy them, because in this day and age, we have the science, the scientific evidence that we can use as pieces in the puzzle to ensure that we get the right outcome, that we understand what has happened and what's going on. Whereas at the time of this case, they really didn't. I think a lot of them have tried their best.
How the scene was handled at the beginning was pretty chaotic from a modern perspective, particularly in the treatment of Hambrough's body. Police officers were eventually stationed at the scene, but not until some weeks later. When I was reading the trial papers, one testimony in particular jumped out at me, the one from Archibald White, the gardener at Ardlamont House. Let's remind ourselves of his observations from his first visiting the scene.
The body was lying upon the grass on the top of the old dyke. I looked at the body and I saw that it was dead. It was lying on its back, turned a little to the left side. There was no gun near the body, and Monson was not carrying a gun when I first saw him. I saw a wound on the back of the head, and there was a good pool of blood under the head on the ground. A small hole in the ground was full of blood. That was all the blood that I saw on the ground. The head was nearest to the rowan seedling, which I knew. We had taken the rug with us. There were other people who were helping. The people present were Stephen, the factor, Stuart, Carmichael, the elder Carmichael, the ploughman, and James Lyon, who had his cart. After placing the rug under Hambrough's feet, we drew it below the body. It was lifted and placed in the cart and taken up to the house.
Maybe White had a whiff of suspicion right from the start. Maybe he was just someone who can't resist trying to piece together a puzzle. Whatever it was, he was curious, and his curiosity led him back to the scene several times.
I went back to the place where the body was found because I had heard that the body had been found in the ditch. The ditch was grown over with grass and ferns. There was no appearance of blood anywhere in the ditch. Mr. Hambrough was a tall man. I think he'd be pretty nearly 6 feet. He was also stout. The brackens and grass there were of such a kind as to have shown traces of the fall of a man of that height and weight into the ditch. There was not the slightest appearance in the ditch of any heavy body having fallen into it.
White wasn't the only one to go back to the scene for a head scratch in the hours after Hambrough was found. John Stephen, the factor, George Lamont, the second keeper, the local GP, Dr. Macmillan, Monson, and so the list goes on. Like White, Stuart McNichol, the estate joiner, commented on the puzzle over where Hambrough's body was supposedly found and the lack of supporting evidence in the ditch.
That morning, as I was returning to my work, I revisited the place where I first saw the body. White was with me, and we saw blood on the top of the dyke where the head had been. White picked up 2 small pieces of bone, in one of which 3 pellets were sticking. The pieces of bone were found on the top of the dyke, 6 or 9 inches from the place where the head had lain, in an easterly direction towards the young plantation. White placed them on top of the dyke and covered them up. While we were undressing the body, somebody had said that it had been found in the ditch, so on this visit to the place, I jumped into the young plantation and walked alongside the ditch for 10 or 12 yards back from the round tree, but saw no marks of blood, nor any marks of a body having fallen into it. I found a track, as if the grass had been trodden down, going to the southwest of the rowan tree. There was also a track from the body going south in the direction of the schoolhouse.
The first thing I thought was, if I was involved in this case and the world and his wife had trampled through it like they did in this case, I would not be best pleased. Just in terms of loss of evidence, a lot was made of how supposedly the deceased was in the ditch and had been recovered from there, but there was no signs of broken ferns. But then we had more people coming in, traipsing through said ditch to see if there was any other evidence. So, you couldn't take any stock in that anyway. But then later on in testimony, we hear statements like, we moved him, but I'm not sure from where, which is understandable. The body goes into just automatic mode, bit of stress response there. But if I had been there, even after all those people had walked through it, I would have had it locked down.
When you compare it with some of the other cases that we've looked at, and the meticulousness and the care that was taken around those events, this is very much different.
Niamh McDade is a professor of forensic science and the director of the Leverhulme Research Centre for Forensic Science at the University of Dundee.
Now, I know from talking in the past and from doing the podcast that you always talk about people turning up at the scene of crime and the first thing you do is put your hands in your pockets. Now, they didn't know necessarily there was a crime that had been committed here when Hambrough initially died. But I wondered if you had any particular thoughts when you were looking at the papers about how even the scene of maybe it wasn't an unusual death, but his death was handled. I mean, I started counting and I got up to about 8 or 10 people tramping through the scene on day one.
Yeah, I think you're dealing with 2 different things here. One is resources and the other is assumptions. So there was an assumption made that this was just a tragic accident, and then potentially it being dealt with less carefully than it would have been if it was an overt or obvious murder that we were dealing with. But you're correct in the number of people that came through, the number of people that would not have been trained in any sort of investigative process or procedure as well. People that perhaps were coming because they wanted to have a look. The consequences of that are that the scene becomes damaged. I mean, crime scenes are all about being able to get information the first time that you attend. Every attendance, every person that comes to those scenes alters those scenes by the fact that they're there. And so trying to minimise that amount of incursion into any sort of scene where physical evidence is going to be crucial is, of course, what it is that you want to try to do. And that wasn't really what happened here.
And there's little doubt that physical evidence was available at the scene. Here's Gardener Archibald White again.
I found 2 small pieces of bone. I found them 6 or 9 inches from the head, between the head and the ditch, on the grass, on the top of the wall. They were lying about 6 or 9 inches from the wall and on the same level as the head. In the larger of the pieces of bone, there were 3 pellets. I showed them to McNichol, the joiner, and then buried them in the pool of blood, which we covered with a sod off the dyke.
2 pieces of bone, one of which had shot embedded in it, but after he'd buried it, and I believe it said in the testimony when it was first recovered, it still had 2 pieces of shot in one of the pieces of, I think they identified it as skull, but whenever it was presented in court, the shot was no longer there. And there was no explanation to where that may have gone. Obviously, things weren't in production bags back in the day. Probably everybody at the police station had a good look at it, touched it, handled it. Who knows where that shot might have gone.
The shot is not the only piece of potential crucial evidence that is lost.
I found a wad on the ground about 2 feet from the head. I noticed blood upon it. I dropped it carelessly. I searched for it frequently but could not find it.
A wad is basically like a tight-fitting bung which separates the powder charge from the shot load inside a shotgun cartridge. We will explain more on that in the next episode and explore why that shotgun wad may have been significant. For the moment, the point I'm trying to make is that potential evidence is being handled and lost by non-expert, self-appointed investigators.
You know, if you think about what the scene would have been, or the circumstances of the family. So this is a country estate, and this is the heir to that estate having died in tragic circumstances. But something perhaps didn't just sound right. The way in which Monson and Scott described the event, perhaps, and you know, whose weapon fired the shot, who was carrying what gun, how could it be that somebody tripping over something would then, yes, that might result in a gun going off, but the circumstances of where the injury was just didn't fit. And I think there's this natural, almost desire for people either associated with the estate and the family who knew them to try to help and figure out what could have happened. That is, in one sense, it's part of a criminal investigation, but it's also our natural curiosity to try to work out and try to provide some help, some closure, some whatever to the family. And of course, in a scene like this, where it wasn't particularly well controlled, to have people wandering back to have a look, or people who may themselves feel that they have a legitimate right to be there, like the gamekeeper or the groundsman or whomsoever, that this is their patch, it's, you know, their area of work, and so have a legitimate grounds to be there, that feel that, you know, they have some level of entitlement to be there to try to work out what happened. So I think there was probably a bit of that going on, but it certainly is different to the other cases we've looked at during the Inside Forensic Science series, where you were dealing with much more overt and obvious murder scenes that were much better controlled than this one.
Interestingly, that need to control a scene, or at least recognise that you need to get in early because the more people who visit a scene, the more it is changed, wasn't lost on White.
I went back alone this time and saw a track leading west from the body and then going south into the bushes. It was a rainy morning and the grass was wet. I first of all followed a track on the top of the dyke southwards for about 20 paces. It was the track of one man and appeared to go southwards in the direction of the schoolhouse. Having followed the trail back along the top of the dyke, I returned to where I first found the body. I then went back to the track leading west from the body. I followed the track and found the two trails join. The place where they joined would be about 15 or 17 paces back from the body.
I think gardening probably was not the best career for him. I definitely think he could have been one of the forefathers of forensic science if he'd just been a bit more careful.
Because he was even going and trying to work out what pathway they would have taken. And he made a point about him going before anyone else had come to the scene.
Yeah.
Although I suspect he was then walking on the pathway. And I was interested to hear you say that you have to come up with a different route to the scene.
Yeah. What did interest me in that, though, obviously he said he went down the track at 50 metres, 50 yards, and saw that it went one way and then went the other way. But later on in his testimony, he said that wouldn't have been made just one trip. That would have been repetitive use. What it doesn't mention anywhere else in any of the statements given is if this path was routinely used as a shortcut or as a byway. So, you know, we were close to the school. Is that where the kids like to run, hide? But yeah, definitely applaud him for having the look and figuring it out. But just, you know, it was almost like we needed that one more reasoning step afterwards.
At the time when the body was lifted, or at any time, no one had been to the place where I found those trails through the bushes.
I think there's a bit of amateurishness involved with the shooting.
Because of the way they've kind of just, in terms of this map, gone together and then split up and separate?
You haven't got a clue what each one is doing. The thing that you should note from that is that F is the direction of Monson and Scott, and G is Hambrough.
Yeah.
Hambrough is to their right.
Right.
And we know he was shot from the left-hand side, which settled in the right-hand side underneath the lug. So this is more evidence to the direction he's been shot in, I think, rather than an accidental shot.
The letters up at the top there, that's where he was found, JKLMO. So this is all what we've got down here.
Yeah.
Right. Fast forward to the present day, and I'm on location on a shooting estate in the Highlands of Scotland, very similar to Ardlamont, with deerstalker Duncan Mackenzie. We've been puzzling over the map of the scene presented in the trial, trying to get a better sense of the landscape Hambrough, Monson and Scott were hunting in. Because if it's possible to determine who was standing where when Hambrough was shot, that might give more information about how he was shot. You'll find a link to the map we're looking at in the show notes. How did you picture this in terms of what kind of landscape we're presented with?
I would say it's rough ground. I would say you would have had gorse, bracken. I mean, you don't want to be shooting rabbits in gorse because you're only seeing them 2-3 yards in front of you. So it's nuts for me, personally.
If it's gorse and bracken as well, this is happening in August. I mean, we both live up in the north of Scotland in the Highlands.
Yeah.
The bracken is about 6 feet tall.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in a case like this, what would happen there is nowadays you would have beaters. So the beaters would be in a big line. Your guns would be at the far end of this strip, say.
Yeah.
And the beaters would push everything, all the game out of this towards the standing guns. The standing guns would then know, okay, there's beaters in front of me. I can't shoot anything on the ground. In fact, the shoots I go to, most of my mates too, it's no ground game. If you shoot at a rabbit, you're binned for life. You've just got to shoot birds in the air. But this is just the Victorians exercising this. We kill everything, and if they can't get a pheasant, they'll get a rabbit, get anything on the deck.
We know from the witness account that it was a pretty wet and miserable day, coarse as it was described. In terms of the landscape and trails through that landscape, is that of any significance that you've got wet grass that they're pushing through? Are they going to leave more of a mark, for example, because it's a wet day? I mean, is that of any significance?
We know it's been very wet. It's blowing a gale, so the vegetation will be flattened anyway. We know there was cows in the area. There's probably deer moving about there. I don't think that the evidence that they've tried to produce here showing the evidence of the landscape is that relevant to what happened. I really don't. I mean, they're in the middle of a dense, scrubby, gorse, brackeny place trying to shoot rabbits, and this guy gets shot. I mean, it's almost as though, let's go in here and shoot him. Let's kill him in here because we're pretty much out of sight here. That's my mind.
Duncan seems to think that the fact that the location would have been challenging for all kinds of reasons might even have been chosen deliberately. What do you think? In fairness to Duncan, he's an ex-policeman and has attended his fair share of rural crime scenes in his time, so he may well have a point. There's no doubt a rural and remote crime scene creates a lot of headaches for a crime scene manager like Rachel Aitken.
Well, speaking from first-hand experience, I've actually been to firearms death in the wilds of Perthshire, almost in Aberdeenshire. First of all, they're generally remote locations, so you've got to get there. You've got to get all your kit there. You know, if you're in the middle of a field, where do you put your cordon? You know, if you don't have a tree to tie some police tape round, what do you do? How do you approach it? How many points do you have to have on the locus? If it's in the middle of a forest or, again, a huge field, how can you be sure that you're not walking the same way that the deceased or an assailant walked? So it's all about weighing up the laws of probability and using a bit of common sense. But in addition, whenever you do have a firearms incident like this, where there's obviously part of the skull has been taken off, shall we say, that what other biological material is there? So if you are out in the countryside, we obviously have the issue of predation. And from a morally decent point of view, you want to make sure that you get every piece of biological material so it can be reunited with the deceased. In addition to that, if we're talking about shotgun deaths, you know, we have the wadding, which sometimes can bear blood on it. And with predation, you know, even our nocturnal little mousey friends, you know, they might think, oh, this is tasty, or this is a nice bit of bedding. So time is really of the essence. And it's a different time constraint to, say, a firearms incident in the middle of a city. You've got time constraints there because obviously traffic stopped, businesses are closed, you've got people trying to see into the scene. But on the flip side, when you're out in the wilderness, it can be much harder to control the external variables.
So what steps would be taken to determine, one, what is potentially forensic evidence, and two, who should collect it and in what order?
Okay, so first things first with all firearms incidents, the firearms officers attend to make sure that the firearm cannot be discharged. So if it's a shotgun, they will observe it. If it's break open, they'll see if there's any cartridges within. If it's a revolver, they'll just check. They will then make it safe, but of course they'll be wearing gloves and a mask at the minimum to make sure they're not disturbing any forensic evidence. Once it is made sure that we can't accidentally discharge the firearm at ourselves or our colleagues, we then focus on the fragile information. So we're talking about DNA, blood, hair fibres, anything that may be on the weapon itself if it's there. And then in consultation with our forensic biology team, we would decide what needed to be taken from the deceased. Has there been an altercation beforehand? Is there any DNA transfer? Is there any fibre transfer from maybe an assailant? And then we've got our forensic firearms scientists who would have a look at gunshot residue. Now, gunshot residue lasts a good bit longer and is slightly less fragile than the biological evidence, so it would definitely be done in that order. We would record, then we would look for the DNA, the blood, the hair, the trace evidence, and then it would be the firearms evidence.
The firearms evidence involved in this case is absolutely crucial, as we're going to hear in the next episode. Once Monson had been arrested at the end of August, there was then an effort to lock the scene down, and 2 police officers were sent to guard the location where Hambrough was found, round the clock, which they duly did. They didn't have the luxury of photographs or video recordings. Instead, there was an effort to record the scene through a surveyor's drawings based on the witness testimonies. Those are the drawings we've been using, and as I've already mentioned, there's a link to them in the show notes, and they're well worth having a look at. We've heard something of how the scene was handled in the hours after Hambrough's death. We've also heard from Rachel how such a scene would be dealt with in a contemporary case. But how might such a scene be managed in the near future?
So I've just popped the headset on and suddenly I'm in a room where there's been a fire.
At the Leverhulme Research Centre for Forensic Science at the University of Dundee, they're developing a new virtual reality tool which could revolutionise how we investigate crimes like the Ardlamont mystery. Vincenzo Rinaldi is the VR and AR application specialist who's working on bringing the crime scene to the investigators and courtroom through 3D reconstruction.
There's windows, there's a radiator, some chairs that have been burnt out. There's a body lying on the ground, a victim of the fire, and I'm standing in the middle of the room. I can turn round, I can look at everything in the space. Odd thing to say, Vincenzo, but I wanted to say it feels incredibly real.
Yeah, it is. This is something that even the fire investigators, the senior fire investigators have noticed. Some of them had some prejudice, some bias against this technology because it's very well known as a console, a video game tool. And as soon as they saw it, they said, I don't want to play video game. I want to do the exercise. I want to train. But then when they wore the headset on, they immediately, and this is something that always strikes me, they put their hands in their pockets, and this happens because they are trained on putting their hands in the pockets when they access the fire scene. This is needed because they have not to touch anything around. So the first layer, the first obstruction for them is actually having their hands in the pockets. But this happened when they got in the VR reconstruction. So this is a way of, let's say, tricking the brain. As soon as they had the headset on, they recognized a familiar environment, which was, for example, in this case, the fire scene, and they started acting exactly like they would act in a real scene. So looking for patterns and, of course, putting their hands in their pockets.
I mean, it's fascinating because I'm moving around the scene now, and I've come up to the chair. There's several chairs, but I'm standing beside a burnt out chair, and I've stopped because there's a chair in my way. And of course, there isn't a chair in my way, it's virtual reality, but it does feel incredibly immersive and real. How did you do this? Did you create this scene and then have to film it, or how is this done in practice?
There are several ways of creating 3D environments. Usually cinema or the movie industry, video games industry, usually model everything from scratch. If we, for example, want to use these as a training tool, we need also the expertise of forensic practitioners. So in this case, we had the Danish police building these setups. This is a fire scene, so building a setup and then burning the scene in real life to then access the scene before the actual training starts to digitalize everything. So we have a scene that is the closest thing that you can find out there because it's created from forensic practitioners for forensic practitioners to train them. Then we injected ourselves in the scene to capture, to have this reconstruction, again, as close as possible to reality, to provide something that is repeatable, that is systematic, and that can enable probably a fairer training.
Could an investigator stand in this room and take measurements of distances?
Absolutely. It is fundamental, though, that the scene is correctly represented and it brings the right scale.
In the case that we're looking at, it's outdoors, it's in a, by the sounds of things, quite a challenging environment. You've read over some of the case. Do you think that case could have benefited from something like being captured in this digital way? Could it be captured in this digital way?
So in this case, for example, laser scanner might be useful to quickly, swiftly, but also accurately digitalize the environment. Instead of walking around and writing down on paper or sketching the area with the risk of missing something and contaminating the scene, it might be easy, for example, to bring the laser scanner at the scene and in just 30-60 minutes collect all the information, freezing the scene and taking these 3D photographs in order to come back later and visit it afterwards. But it's also useful because a laser scanner will come with the scale of the environment. So you will be walking around the real, almost a digital twin of the scene.
Presumably, if you've captured it digitally, then it's preserved. Anyone can see, even if something's been removed from that scene, where it was originally.
Yeah. For example, if you make a scan immediately after the scene is discovered and after several days after the investigation started, you can see whether or not any of the tools, any of the traces has been removed, how the environment changed. This is also particularly interesting, for example, in outdoor environments, because if the weather doesn't really help, you can see how the scene changes throughout time. And you can see how it was presented to the first responders, to the scene of a crime officers, and how it is presented now. And this is something peculiar for this technology, because if you want, for example, come back in real life to the real scene, you're always seeing a different scene, especially if it's in an outdoor environment. But any scene suffers from contamination. It might be the weather, it might be people that are working at the scene, it might be that sometimes you cannot preserve the scene forever. So this is something that can bring value as an investigative tool.
It's not hard to imagine just what an impact VR would have had in the Ardlamont investigation, and to us. Just imagine how much easier it would be for you, me, and of course a jury to picture a murder scene if we could just pop on a headset and have a wander round. If you want to hear my full conversation with Vincenzo, we've dropped a bonus episode. You can also visit a demo of the burnt-out scene I visited. But don't disappear just yet, because we're still in the thick of it, investigating this particular crime. With Monson arrested, the scene is now locked down, so no more staff wandering around hiding, losing or destroying evidence. And the police investigation is well underway.
The Westminster Gazette, 31st August. It is reported that the body of Hambrough is to be exhumed.
An application to the Home Secretary for authority to exhume the body of Lieutenant Hambrough was duly dispatched to the Home Office on Thursday.
It was exhumed yesterday afternoon at Ventnor in the presence of an immense crowd of spectators. Dr. Littlejohn of Edinburgh and Dr. Macmillan, who first examined the deceased, these two representing the Crown. Dr. Saunders of Edinburgh also arrived by the same train to be present at the examination on behalf of the prisoner, Monson.
So what will the post-mortem uncover about the crime? There were 2 guns, but can we discover which gun caused the fatal injury? Could it be possible that Hambrough and Monson's shotguns were deliberately switched? And did someone attempt to murder Hambrough the night before he died? If so, why? And what has happened to the mysterious Scot?
Pall Mall Gazette, 12th of October. The Ardlamont shooting mystery. Why is not Scot discovered? Scot is well known. He is not a lag or a lumberer in his professional capacity, and the link which connects him with Monson and his friends is strong. If he is ever discovered, I prophesy it will surprise a great many people that he was not arrested before.
Lloyd's Weekly, London, 15th October. The present position is this. The police say they have no power to act on suspicion and are handicapped for want of funds. The man Scot, by his absence, has deprived the authorities of his testimony as to the death of young Hambrough. It is not too much to say that Monson's life is now in his hands.
The story first broached last week of the man Scot being a London bookmaker is confirmed by several correspondents. His real name is said to be Edward Davis, but he is generally known amongst racing men as Long Ted.
Will Scot, or should that now be Long Ted, ever be found? Don't miss the next episode of Inside Forensic Science, the Ardlamont Mystery. In episode 2 of the Ardlamont Mystery, the experts were Rachel Aitken, Professor Neve McDade, Vincenzo Rinaldi and Duncan Mackenzie. The actors were Paul Murray, Mark Stephen, Yana Miller, Jake Lee, Sam Young, Pam McIntosh, Alan Richardson and Neil Wallace. Inside Forensic Science is written and presented by me, Pennie Stuart. The story consultants and series researchers are Heather Duran and Clara Morris. The sound mix was by Steve Bull. Inside Forensic Science, the Ardlamont Mystery is an Adventurous audio production for the Leverhulme Research Centre for Forensic Science at the University of Dundee and is funded by the Leverhulme Trust.